Boston, at the turn of the century, was an exciting place to be. Construction of new buildings was going on everywhere, especially in the nearby fill land of the Fens. It was at this time that a well-known Boston aristocratic lady was on her way to a barren, marshy land, isolated and surrounded by muddy flats. And it was here that her Venetian palace would be built, and she would call it Fenway Court. Many books have been written about Isabella Stewart Gardner, and even more have been written about the still unsolved theft of priceless art. And just as the theft remains a mystery, so doesn't the great lady we know as Mrs. Jack. What is known is that Isabella burnt many of her letters before she died. Why? What was she trying to erase? We'll never know. One of her biographers, Patricia Vigderman, calls the Fenway Court the Memory Palace, and here she tries to penetrate the mystery that was Isabella.
I mean, it's not always, there aren't always...
Yeah, the rooms, the way the rooms are arranged are very particular, and she said you couldn't move any of them. It was all about what she, but it was all about her. And I thought, who is this rich woman, who takes this art and does with it what she wants, and doesn't really seem to have any regard for people who are coming into, it's a very untraditional museum. And so in the course of writing the book, what I was doing was coming to understand who she was, what she was doing. For me, it was a way to get close to somebody in the past.
And although it's been almost a century since Isabella died and left us her famous palazzo, we are still run by her strict rules. Nothing can be sold, nothing can be moved, nothing can be altered. Isabella Stewart Gardner was born on April 14, 1840, in New York City, the first daughter of David Stewart, a well-to-do Scottish American. She was called Belle as a young girl, and Gardner spent much of her childhood in the genteel old New York society, as chronicled in the novels of Edith Wharton and Henry James, both of whom she would later know as an adult. Years ago, I decided that the greatest need in our country was art. We were a very young country and had very few opportunities to see beautiful things, works of art. So I determined to make it my life's work if I could. Isabella began her education in the private schools of New York. After the tragic death of a younger sister, her parents would accompany her to a finishing school in Paris, an event that would change her life forever. Here she'd be exposed to the art and culture of Europe, and her future vision of a personal museum would take root. In Milan, a famous palazzo turned into a museum filled her with the inspiration to one day do the same. That's if she had the money. And years later, in 1923, her classmate reminded her, "Isabella, you always dreamt that you would have a house like the one in Milan, filled with beautiful pictures and objects of art, for people to come and enjoy, and you have carried out your dream." Isabella was not a great beauty, and many artists tried to paint her later in flattering portraits. And yet, in her youth, she was captivating and exuberant, enchanting all those around her, especially men, who saw in her a vivacious girl full of excitement and adventure.
She went to finishing school in Paris, as did Julia Gardner, the younger sister of Jack Gardner. And when they came home, Isabella went back to New York and Julia Gardner went back to Boston. Isabella was invited to the Gardner home in Boston, and she met his entire family. And at that point, Jack seems to have taken a very strong fancy to her. And what's romantic is that it appears that they decided to get married within a matter of days. He asked her, and she said, well, if you would like to marry me, I think you should come speak to my father, which of course was the custom then. So he did, and they became engaged, and they were married in 1860. She was barely 20, he was 23.
Jack Gardner was the heir to the Salem shipping fortune, and in marrying him, Isabella became part of the legendary stiff and proper Boston Brahmin society. She had a hard time fitting in. The rules of decorum and proper behavior plagued Belle, who continued to be a free spirit in search of new ideas and enlightenment, something she did not find in the close society of ladies' sewing circles of Boston.
Well, when she first came to Boston, she was always a positive person, but they say that she was shunned by the local women her age. They were quite jealous of the fact that she had stolen one of Boston's most eligible bachelors, and they excluded her from things like sewing circles, and there were other things as well.
In the meantime, Belle's new role as a mother would begin with the birth of their long-awaited child, nicknamed Jackie.
Well, she became more sedate in her manner when she became a mother. She was very thrilled to become a mother. But before then, she had already gotten people going by the fact that she was a great dancer. She was very lively. She loved to be with men. She wore clothes that were different than the women in Boston wore. And so that also led to this kind of tension between her and Boston society. When she became a mother, apparently that changed, but of course her son died when he was only 21 months old.
And Belle would be left depressed and alone. Her grief and isolation from society led to a long, debilitating period of bed rest. On advice from her doctor, and as a cure for Belle's depression and weakness, the Gardners would begin a series of journeys that would have a profound impact on them for the rest of their lives. Venice, their favorite place, would also become their part-time residence. In their yearly trips abroad, she and Jack would develop a new network of expat friends, artists, writers, musicians, all meeting at Palazzo Barbaro in Venice. Here, Isabella would form lifelong friendships with expats like Sargent, Whistler, and Henry James. It was a lifestyle she championed and led to her title of being a patron of the arts. And just as significant was Isabella's exposure to the art and architecture of Venice. And perhaps it was here that the idea of building a Venetian palazzo in Boston with her collection of art would take root. With her lifelong friendship with Bernard Berenson, her art buyer abroad, and with the inheritance of her father's estate, her dream of building a museum would come true.
Well, in 1891, she inherited about $1.7 million from her father, which in those days probably equaled $30 to $40 million, in that range. And after that, she began to buy these very important paintings like the Vermeer, then the Rembrandt, and in this room, the Titian Europa, and also the Velázquez of Philip IV. So these are priceless paintings, and the kind that other museums bid for in some cases, that Bernard Berenson was able to procure for her. And so it solidified the idea that this was going to be a great museum. And with the size of these paintings, they were not going to fit, certainly, in the Beacon Street home, no matter how much they might have enlarged it.
Over the 8-year period in which her collection of paintings took shape, Isabella bought more than 20 pieces through Berenson to the tune of $750,000. The market for old masters only continued to inflate with time, giving her collection a value of many times her investment. But acquiring masterpieces was a complicated business. Many saw this as appropriating the heritage of other nations to build her own collection. Isabella saw this as a way of saving the arts of impoverished aristocrats, and there was a price to pay.
A lot of that involved circumventing the rules. Both the U.S. Customs rules and the rules in Europe about taking, about removing things, national treasures from Italy or from France.
And perhaps the biggest obstacle was financing this astronomical endeavor. Isabella was not at the level of the other famous millionaires like the Morgans, Vanderbilts, and Fricks, all of whom were beginning their own art collections.
And they had more money than she did.
But Isabella was the visionary in locating, purchasing, and importing great works of art for future art collections in America. But that's not to say that Isabella didn't live up to the image. Her exquisite taste in the arts also applied to how she dressed herself, and to that end she used the Paris salon of the famous Worth.
There was a very famous dressmaker in France toward the end of the 19th century named Worth, W-O-R-T-H. He made beautiful dresses for ladies, and you could go to Paris and you would go to Worth and order up dresses, and they would make them to order, and the style was much more advanced than what ladies were wearing.
The ultimate signature for wealthy lady was to have her portrait done by a famous painter, and for Isabella, that would be Sargent. Sargent, the most successful American portrait painter of his time, gained fame through his unique approach of capturing the inner life force of his sitters. But it was his notorious portrait of the sensual and audacious Madame X that most intrigued Belle. Rather than condemn the work, like most outraged Parisians, Isabella praised it and wanted her portrait done too.
Originally, this was done in 1888 by John Singer Sargent, and when the public saw it, there was a lot of acclaim for it. Some people thought it was a marvelous portrait. Other people were scandalized by it. So if you take a look at it, I don't know if you can see anything that might, if you were a Victorian person living in the conservative city of Boston in 1888, what might have scandalized you?
You can see the cleavage. It was not displayed you know, when it was first painted, it wasn't displayed, prominently for people to see. People made jokes about it.
In fact, Mr. Gardner did not want it shown to the public in his lifetime.
Well, remember she had this relationship with Marion Crawford, with Frank Crawford, and somebody said, he painted her all the way down to Crawford's Notch. Crawford's Notch it's in New Hampshire.
And it was no accident that the similarities between the two seductive ladies would cause quite a stir.
It just didn't seem to be something to put in the living room.
Rumors, gossip, and criticism seemed to follow Belle everywhere, but with a supportive husband, she seemed to handle it well. Tragically, Jack Gardner would suddenly die at the age of 62, and Belle would be left alone. But without the financial support and logical business acumen she once took for granted, life without Jack was difficult and challenging. Their initial plan to build a museum behind their Beacon Street house seemed to fade as a more reasonable project that Jack Gardner had once envisioned took hold. Their museum would be erected on a new piece of land at the newly developed Fenway under an extensive project of Olmsted. Here, Frederick Olmsted, famous for Central Park, would design the Emerald Necklace of Boston. The land around the fence, once tidal flats, would be developed into future building land for commercial, residential, and recreational use.
Was inspired by the Palazzo Barbaro in Venice, where Mrs. Gardner spent many summers as a guest and also renting. And she used the Palazzo Barbaro as an inspiration. It's not a copy. And what she did is at certain periods she went to Venice and was able to purchase these windows, the columns, and everything, and almost all of them are period. There are a few that aren't, but in essence her genius was that she was able to put them together so that if you don't look carefully, you don't realize that the windows on the second floor are quite different than the windows on the third floor. The windows on the first floor are what we call Venetian Gothic. The windows on the second floor are more like the Gothic windows that you'd see in a French cathedral. So she was able to do that with the balconies and the columns. What was so brilliant is that there were no computers then. So these things were brought by ship, and they were in warehouses, and they were numbered boxes. Eventually there was a shed on the grounds. And when she wanted these items, and that includes the ancient statuary, everything here is old, she would call them forth. She would let her workmen know which column to bring, which window to bring, and they would bring them, and she would figure out where to place them.
For the greatest challenge of her life, building her Palazzo Museum, Belle would hire the well-known architect of the new Church of Boston. Willard Sears, already a well-known and successful builder, undertook the difficult task of working with a very difficult client.